Hello and welcome to the April 10th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway and I'm here with Romeo Kukratsky.
Hey all.
This episode will mostly be dealing with two large issues. First of all, we'll be going into the issue of Russia recruiting foreign fighters into their military, and then also a absolutely insane document issued by the Russian Orthodox Church, essentially declaring holy war against the West. But first, some smaller issues that we'll go over before we get into them. So first, the combat update. As the situation around Avdiivka has kind of matured, what we are seeing is that the part of the line to the north of Avdiivka has really slowed down. The Russians there have once again settled into a position of attacking across mostly empty roads and getting blown up a lot, losing a lot of vehicles in the process, to the point where this northern section, again, likely, as I've been talking about the last two episodes, likely because of them running into these rivers, these lakes, are slowing down. So the offensive to the north of Avdiivka seems to have more or less culminated a bit, at least for the last month, has not proceeded very far. The southern part of that axis, though, they're continuing to make substantial progress, including within the last week or two. So the area around Avdiivka has not fully settled in. As we've seen, every time Russia takes a new area, it tends to slow down a bit after that. Avdiivka is still active, but again, to the north, less so active than to the kind of middle. The real area where the combat situation is evolving slowly but importantly is the area of Chasiv Yar. As we were talking about during the siege of Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar was the military staging area during that battle. It has been a staging area ever since the 2014-2015 phase of the war. A lot of military offices and stuff were located within Chasiv Yar. And we've been talking about it, that is the kind of gateway to the larger battle for Donbass that will eventually come, hopefully not, but looks like it might, in the area of Slovyansk and around there. So Chasiv Yar, the Russians have been slowly pushing out of Bakhmut towards Chasiv Yar since the fall of Avdiivka. This is not a very large territory, so the advances that we're talking about are not large, but they are, like I said, important. The Russians have now reached the outskirts of Chasiv Yar, and I do believe that this will be the next battle that we'll be talking about. It is not a large place. It is smaller than Avdiivka, it's smaller than Bakhmut, but due to the geographic position of it, it is a real stronghold. So this is the next, I think, battle that we're going to have to be paying attention to, is the defense of Chasiv Yar.
Looking to Kharkiv, Russia is continuing its campaign to make Kharkiv basically unlivable. Russian precision strikes have destroyed almost the entirety of Kharkiv's power grid. Even mobile networks are glitchy in the city, and they have not let up with their strikes. There were 2 strikes on Kharkiv as of today, as we're recording, April 9th, resulting in a few casualties, and they don't seem to let up. They are continuously targeting civilian areas of Kharkiv with the expressly stated goal, according to one propagandist on Russian state TV, of making Kharkiv uninhabitable.
Yeah, the rolling blackout problem is continuous in Kharkiv. There were a lot of Russian strikes, like I talked about in the last episode, against Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. A lot of that has been made up for by other sources, including imports from the European Union, by repairs of parts that have come in from the European Union. But in Kharkiv specifically, that has not been as successful. And the city, the second largest city in Ukraine, is being gradually made unlivable. And that is what the Russians said they were doing. They said they want to knock Kharkiv back to the Stone Age and sap Ukraine of its will to fight.
Really protecting Russian speakers, aren't they?
Yeah, Kharkiv, the very predominantly Russian-speaking city, the people who Russia says they want to defend, are being, as they say, knocked back to the Stone Age. Now, what the Ukrainians are asking for now is support in striking back against this. Unfortunately, everything that Russia is using to attack Kharkiv with is located within the borders of the Russian Federation. The missile launchers, the airfields used for the bombers, because like we described, they're now using more of these glide bombs dropped from planes on the city. And all of that, in order to stop these attacks, means attacking targets within the Russian Federation, which is something that our American partners are consistently against Ukraine doing. So Ukraine is able to strike within the borders of the Russian Federation using weaponry developed and built in Ukraine specifically, but not with the foreign aid. And that makes the defense of Kharkiv, the second largest city in the country, much more difficult to do.
Now, in fact, according to analysts, including Colby Badawar, who had a very large Twitter thread on it, which I recommend you read if you're interested. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but he does point out that Senate Republicans have used U.S. President Joe Biden's refusal to provide Ukraine with long-range cruise missiles, specifically ATACMS, as one of the reasons that they are reluctant to bring Ukraine aid to a vote, since if the administration does not treat Ukraine as a priority, why should the Republican Party? And of course, while the Republican Party is using that as an excuse, it is a valid point. The Biden administration's slow walking of aid and the complete refusal to provide other types of badly needed weapons is, in fact, one of the reasons why it's harder to convince Congress, specifically the Republicans, that defending Ukraine is in the national interest of the United States.
This will obviously be a story that we'll be talking about a lot. The attack on Kharkiv is not likely to end anytime soon, and we'll just need to learn more what we can when we can about that. So the last combat-related update that I'll have to give, we look up northwards to the Baltic Sea. So not the Black Sea that we're used to talking about, but the Baltic Sea. And within the Black Sea, the Russian fleet has been very significantly depleted by Ukrainian strikes from drones, from missiles. But now, if we look at the Baltic, at the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, amazingly, the Ukrainians managed to blow up, or catch on fire, I should say. The Ukrainians managed to damage a missile ship at Kaliningrad, the Serpukov. The Ukrainian military intelligence has taken credit for this attack. So it was kind of obvious, like, who else is attacking the Russians in the Baltic Sea. But it's very interesting that they're able to take credit for it. I'm glad they did. The Black Sea has been shut down. The Black Sea fleet of the Russian Federation has been shut down as or any real combat capable fleet in being. It's now just existing as targets and as, well, missile launchers. And this is a real flex by Ukrainian spies and saboteurs to take them out in what the Russians thought was a safe place in Kaliningrad.
It's impressive that Hur pulled off an operation so far outside Ukraine's borders. In fact, considering that the operation was pulled off in an exclave surrounded by European nations, it's likely that Hur was not operating alone, though, of course, that is likely never to be revealed. At the same time, the Russians must have gotten quite a fright when they realized that Ukraine has the capability of striking them in Kaliningrad, which they probably assumed was safe given how it is surrounded by Europe.
Stepping away from the direct combat, looking towards the support for the fighting, we've had a few episodes where we talked about the severe need for mobilization reform, conscription, people being called up to join the military. And there's, all these bills that have been in the parliament that are seemingly going nowhere. Lots of discussion within civil society that seem to be going in circles. It is something that nobody wants to do, even though it is something that needs to be done. And we did get a bit of an update on that. So outside of any normal mobilization reform bill, this was slid into other stuff. The age for mobilization in Ukraine has been lowered from 27 to 25, which is not a very large drop, but it has made waves within Ukrainian society, seeing as how this opens up mobilization to a younger cohort of people, the 25-year-olds and 26-year-olds. And there's been some hesitation about this, partially because Ukraine has a bit of a demographic divot in that age range. Ukraine simply doesn't have a lot of people within their mid-20s. Around the year 2000, Ukraine was in the late 90s and early 2000s, Ukraine was in a very severe economic recession. And when that happens, people tend not to have very many babies. And so here we are, 25 years later, and there's not as many people within that group. So to mobilize them causes a demographic threat to Ukraine, and that's why it has been delayed. Even though when you think of fighting age people, you tend to think of people in their 20s, not people in their 30s and 40s, as is often the case in Ukraine.
Military officials, a military official, I forget, he was a ground forces commander of some stripe, revealed in an interview recently that the median age of the Ukrainian conscript is in their mid 40s, which is not really what you think of when you think of a military. Quite frankly, whereas most countries have conscription starting at 18, Ukraine's kind of refusal to do so is not only driven, I think, by demographic concerns, but by the simple fact that no one wants to send their kids to fight.
Yeah, you do hear this a lot from older soldiers, this refrain of saying that we are fighting the Russians now so that our children and grandchildren won't have to fight the Russians in their generation. It's real tricky. 20-year-olds are better fighters than 40-year-olds. That's just what it is. But they're like I said, the demographics and what Romeo said with this ideological factor as well.
The simple fact
rough.
of the matter is that the Ukrainian military doesn't have any men, and there's no political will in the country to fix conscription in any way that would alleviate that problem. Quite frankly, it's hard to imagine a real solution to the manpower issue that the Ukrainian military is running into, aside from massively widening conscription, which is, of course, what the Ministry of Defense has proposed in their own version of conscription reform, and the military has its own suggestions for conscription reform. But as you can imagine, Parliament is incredibly hesitant to pass anything that would increase the conscription of the 18 to 25-year-old cohort.
Like I said, this was kind of snuck in outside of normal conscription reform discussions, even though it is quite necessary. So any further developments along those lines will be much more hard going. Although Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, seemed to have found an alternative to mobilization. I'm skeptical of how much of an alternative it is. But with the manpower concerns in play, there was an audit of the Ukrainian military to see what everyone's doing. And the result of that audit was able to find quite a few units, quite a few soldiers that weren't actually doing all that much. And so they will be rotated into more active positions, making the force organization much more efficient with the resources available rather than increasing the amount of resources available. How far this will go, it doesn't really solve the problem, so it only do so much. But getting leaner, getting more efficient, it'll cover some of the missing gap, hopefully.
And finally, we move on to one of our two main topics for today's episode, starting with the prevalence of foreign fighters in the full-scale invasion. And just to kind of wave off any accusations that we are somehow ignoring the Ukrainian factors, let's actually start with an overview of the foreign fighters who are operating in Ukraine on behalf of the Ukrainians.
Yeah, for this specifically, I wanted to get into the foreign units. We're going to kind of pass over the International Legion for now. That's not really what we're talking about. But if we look at these raids into Russian territory, like I mentioned last time, there have been various small-scale offensives across the borders into the Russian Federation, into the Belgorod and Kursk oblasts. This is a repeat. They've done this a few times, and the units involved in them are recruited from citizens of the Russian Federation. We went over the two main groups already, the Freedom of Russia unit and the Russian Volunteer Corps. The Russian Volunteer Corps being much more ideologically far right, and the Freedom of Russia Legion being more depoliticized, not outwardly ideological in the same way that the Russian Volunteer Corps is. We already kind of did an episode about them, so we're not going to get too into that. But the new group to this is the Siberian Corps. The Siberian Corps is mostly made up of citizens of the Russian Federation. There's specific words for this in the Russian language to differentiate between an ethnic Russian and a citizen of Russia. So for this purposes, I'm saying citizen of Russia to highlight that difference. The Siberian Corps is primarily recruiting from these non-ethnic Russians, people from Yakutia, people from Buryatia, and it's headed up by an officer named Vladislav Amanosov. He is an ethnic Yakut. He claims to be a former intelligence officer in the Russian military, former GRU officer, rather. Is this true? Who knows? People claim to be a lot of things, but I haven't really seen it challenged per se. So yeah, sure, why not? He was an intelligence officer in Russia. There's this movement for non-Russian minorities within Russia called the Free Nations League that's supported by Ukraine and is meant to attract the support of dissidents within Russia. The Free Nations League is kind of based around the principle of more or less fracturing Russia into its component parts, many of them ethnic nations, again, like Yakutia, Buryatia, Dagestan, etc. And a lot of these ethnic communities have representation in this Free Nations League, advocating for their own independence and hoping that Russia's failure in the war with Ukraine will lead to their own independence in one way or another later on. How realistic that is, who's to say, but it is something they're going for. And the Siberian Corps is kind of located within this context of the Free Nations League and this push by Russian minorities who see this war as their own path to freedom.
I'll say from the Ukrainian perspective, the Ukrainian government has been pretty openly supporting these minority groups and supporting independence movements. One example being the recognition of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria by Ukraine, close to the start of the full-scale invasion. But the Ukrainian military intelligence corps has been working with partisans in Tatarstan and other Russian republics, as they call them, to foment more pro-independence sentiment. And so I think it's fair to say that this is an avenue that the Ukrainian government is very avidly pursuing.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that in addition to the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Russian Volunteer Corps, and the Siberian Corps, these incursions into Russian territory have also included these Chechens. There's a variety of Chechen units, all of them now operating under the banner of Ichkeria, which has been recognized and is a government in exile, we can say, that exists in Ukraine for Chechnya. We've also seen some units organized around the Karelian ethnic group, and also, other Russian-speaking but not in Russia as well. So we're looking at some Georgians and such have also joined in on these efforts and part of this broader coalition of people who are directly being oppressed by Russia, either within the formal borders of the Russian Federation or what they call their near abroad, as part of it's almost being presented in Ukraine as a quote unquote civil war within Russia. I would not go that far, but it's really trolling of how the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics were set up by Russia under the command of Russian officers. And they said that it was a Ukrainian civil war. So now that Ukraine is building up these military units under the coordination and command of the Ukrainian military, just a inversion of that rhetoric to kind of troll them on it is what it mostly is. I don't think that anyone is really presenting this as a purely indigenous movement within Russia. And to finish off this segment on Ukraine, there is another update from the Kastis Kolinovsky Regiment. This is the Belarusians. They have recently expanded their efforts. They said they are, quote, no longer volunteer, but professional, by which they mean they're not like a militia like they used to be, but like a fully professional military unit. They have their own drone units, armor, and they've also decided to consider themselves the, quote, new Belarusian army, the military of Belarus. That's actually represents Belarus rather than the Russian puppet government that currently sits in Minsk.
And that's basically all of the quote unquote foreign fighters fighting on behalf of Ukraine. Not This is without mentioning, of course, the fighters that are part of the International Legion and so on. But really, it's even though those guys may get a lot of press because a lot of them are Westerners, the fact it's these units that have the majority of non-Ukrainian citizens fighting on behalf of Ukraine. And as we've just recounted, most of these people aren't fighting purely because they think Ukraine is a good cause. They're fighting to free themselves from the oppression that Russia and Belarus have put on them, which I think does change the dynamic a little bit and serves as another way to push back against the Russian propaganda of Ukraine being flooded with these foreign mercenaries. The fact is, when you run a shitty, repressive, authoritarian regime, there are going to be people who want to shoot you. Them's the breaks.
Oh, and one more addendum to that. There was also a Polish unit that attached itself to the incursions into Russia as well. But I didn't have so much information about them. But the more meat of this, what made me think more about this segment was we've been receiving a steady drumbeat of news updates out of Russia about various attempts to recruit foreigners.
Or press gang, as the case may be.
Yes, as the case may be. And this issue really began to become more of an international problem starting in September, when Cuba announced that it was doing a crackdown of Russian recruiters who are operating within Cuba. But now we're hearing more and more about it. We're getting more videos of the recruitment process, more videos of how these foreign soldiers are being treated. So I wanted to kind of go over what we have known, especially within this year that we've been hearing about them more and more. So a bit of the beginning of this story is that the Russians had always been using foreign units in Ukraine.
Or at least they've always been using foreigners or non-Russian citizens.
Yeah, often organized within their own units. So if we look to 2014, a lot of the more active units in the, quote, Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic's armies were these foreign volunteers. And many of them were ideological in nature. And this ideology tend to either be straight up Nazis or National Bolsheviks who are Nazis that wear hammers and sickles. The National Bolshevik movement was quite active in recruiting people to join the Donetsk People's Republic from outside of Ukraine. So we're talking both Russians and also Europeans and Americans as well. One of the larger groups of these were the Serbs.
Serbs never met a genocide they didn't want to take part in.
And these very specific Serbs were already genocidaires. Following the Yugoslav wars, there were a lot of death gangs who found themselves without employment. So in the Yugoslav wars, the Russians had very heavily backed the Serbian. The Russian intelligence had very heavily backed Serb militias, as we talked about when we were talking about Igor Girkin. He was a Russian intelligence unit who was embedded with Republika Srpska forces. And when it came time to repay the deal, a lot of these Serb death gang people, including the Archon Tigers, one of the worst of them, sent people to join the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. I remember there's one video released by Vice early on where they were at a checkpoint in the DNR, and the people manning the checkpoint were, I'm pretty sure they were Arkan Tigers, these extremist, genocidal Serb militias, only now, older. 2014 as opposed to 1999. So they're always there, and they're always very ideological, very violent, and importantly, very experienced parts of that movement. We also saw various groups. There was one unit of Bulgarians called the Orthodox Dawn. There was Hungarians. There was a lot. It was a real ideological grab bag of the worst who all volunteered to join the LDNR. And this also gave more cover because it didn't have to necessarily be a uniformed Russian soldier doing the killing. It could be a Serb, a Bulgarian, a Belarusian who just volunteered to defend the peoples of Donetsk on his own accord. So there, like I said, there's a lot of these, and some of that structure remained. So even now, some of these units have still technically existed, although not in the same.
And it's hard to say how many of them have survived this this far into the war.
Yeah, of course, they're used as like very expendable. If you're a Russian, you're already expendable. If you're not a Russian, then good luck to you.
As we'll go into in multiple examples during this segment, including this one where there was a video posted to Telegram by some Serb fighters in Russia complaining that they were being discriminated against by the ethnic Russians. They were being called gypsies and assigned the worst work, like digging latrines and trenches. I assume if you are an experienced genocidaire who's already murdered numerous Bosnian villages, you probably expected a little more respect for all the wanton murder and genocide that you did. But nope, Russians don't care. They don't care how many people you've killed. If you're not Russian, you're trash.
And I assume that if you happen to be a Serb ultranationalist, being called a gypsy
has to be some level of insult, right?
They tend not to like the Romani people very much, so they're not having a good time. And so throughout all the years of the Donbass War, as I have been calling it for efficiency's sake, these units have been quite prominent, and they were folded into the Russian military now, just as all LDNR units have. And like in the case with the video, they tend to no longer exist within these discrete units like they used to. They're a Russian army now. They are distributed where they are needed, and where they're needed is. And I will say that this practice of distributing foreign soldiers not within their own units seems like a terrible idea to me. Like we were talking about with these Russian recruits in the Ukrainian military, they are going towards these Russian units. Within the Foreign Legion, there's, it tends to be English speaking broadly, but they have their own kind of foreigner English speaking command structures, because we're not going to expect someone to take, an intensive course of Ukrainian and join the normal Ukrainian military, although some do, such as our good friend Jim, who we had interviewed before. Because he speaks local languages, he was able to transition into local units. But on the Russian side, they don't really have an organization for this.
They likely don't want one. My assumption is one of the reasons they do that is to prevent the formation of a cohesive ethnic militia that they later would not be able to control. If you throw around all these people across all these different units and they're not serving together, it's going to be a lot harder for them to form any sense of community or organization later on. And given the shit treatment that they receive in the military, I assume that concern is actually quite relevant.
Yeah. And again, I always have to stop and say this isn't universal. Some of these units do exist, but in the broad sweep of things, this is how it's working. And as part of these increase in videos of these foreign soldiers that have become public within the last 3-4 months, I remember one of them specifically was about a Russian unit leader who was complaining about having to be a translator. So he was the guy who spoke English within that unit. And because English is the international language, that became a default to speak to people, I suppose. And I'm sure that really that really kicks them in the gut, is that in the Russian military, they still have to use English to speak to people from Nigeria or something who come in.
Look, it's just the fact that America has cultural dominance across the globe.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't enjoy that, though. And yeah, so he's complaining about how he has to be a translator for all these guys. It's not his job. Well, it should be someone's job. I don't want to give them notes, but that should be someone's job.
No, screw it. The more disorganized, the better.
Yeah, exactly. I've just been thinking about this a lot, of why they choose to organize along these lines when it seems it would be much more useful to have communication on some level with these people who don't speak Russian, because most people outside of Russia in the immediate surrounding areas of the former Soviet Union tend not to speak Russian very well. So you can't have a Russian speaking force including all of these non-Russian speakers. It seems obvious to me.
Look at it from the perspective of not, fighting a war in an optimal manner, but maintaining internal security while using a bunch of non-human citizens, or non-human non-citizens rather, then it makes perfect sense. You don't want, like I said, you don't want these people to gather in groups. You don't want them to share stories, to swap sentiments, to plan anything outside the strictures of the Russian military. And so, yeah, you're just going to throw them in whatever unit you care to do so, and make sure that they just can't really talk to each other and can't really communicate. But the people from post-Soviet states are not the only foreign fighters that Russia is recruiting. We already mentioned Cuba, but Russia is also going very heavily, or at least seemingly heavily, on recruiting as far afield as Nepal, India, and even African nations.
Like we kind of passed over some of the foreign recruits in the Ukrainian military, what we're passing over is the foreign recruits in the Russian military. Well, like Romeo said, in the former Soviet Union, Russia has put a lot of pressure on recruiting Kazakhs and Uzbeks and Tajiks who have immigrated to Russia, and in some cases telling them, do you want to stay in Russia? Well, army for you. And that has been pretty productive for them, apparently. But we're kind of skipping over that from now, looking at the further afield ones. So Nepal. Nepal has been a large source of foreign fighters in the Russian military. And if you know much about Nepal, this actually makes a lot of sense. Some of the most famous fighters from Nepal are the Gurkhas. The Gurkhas are an elite unit within the British military, Nepal being a former British colony, who are known for being some of the most badass people on the planet. They are known to, hold down entire enemy units with one incredibly crazy Nepali guy with a knife. Lots of stories. People who serve alongside the British Army tend to have stories about some Gurkha doing some crazy nonsense and just being amazed by it. These are a very elite fighting unit. Elite, but also expendable. Elite, because we're still talking about foreign recruits in the British military. And if you are a Nepali guy who wants to fight, that's the first place where you want to look. That's the best of the best. That's the Ivy League of Nepali foreign fighters, is the Gurkha units in the British military. However, they find their way around a lot of mercenary companies, a lot of foreign militaries, including the United States. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, a lot of the people hired to drive logistics trucks were Nepali. A lot of the people within infrastructure and the whole world of military contracting, Nepalis are not rare. We have also seen a lot of Nepalis in the French Foreign Legion. I was recently listening to one description of the French Foreign Legion, and alongside some of the English speakers and the Russian speakers, there's very large faction or contingent of Nepalis in there. If you aren't good enough to be a Gurkha, maybe, then the French Foreign Legion is a good place for you. Nepal is a very poor country, and this is just a very popular avenue to take to get out of poverty there. But you may notice that all those places tend to pay more than what Russia can pay. And so a lot of people are still being drawn to Russia. There have been recruitment drives in Nepal in order to bring Nepalis to join the Russian military. Some of them more honest, some of them less honest, some of them being told straight up, you can join the military this way. A lot of Nepalis actually finding ways to join the Russian military, including kind of really going out of their way in order to do it. And so there have been a lot of Nepalis joining the Russian military, to the point where now Nepal, being very concerned about this, has ended work permits to Russia. Now, if you are in Nepal, in order to work overseas, you need a work permit, like to leave, not just in the country you go to, but also from Nepal itself, is how I understand it. And they have just shut down this permit process for Russia and Ukraine as well, though not as many Nepalis are in Ukraine as are in Russia. And this is something that the Nepali government is taking seriously, kind of like what the Cuban government is taking seriously. They don't want their citizens to join the Russian military and then get killed, partially because people look to them as being responsible. And also, you just don't want your people being killed overseas. That's just tends to be something people don't want.
The fundamental jobs of a government is to protect their citizens when they travel overseas. Even the poorest governments at least try to pay a fig leaf to that concept. And it doesn't look good when a bunch of your citizens are reported on CNN as having been killed in a war they have nothing to do with, thousands of miles away from their homeland.
And of course, some of these permits are illegitimate as well, because they are lured to Russia for work in one way or another. We'll talk about this later when we talk about why people do this. We're just going over countries right now. But they have to protect their citizens from what's essentially human trafficking rings as well. But also throughout South Asia, this Russian recruiters are quite active. So, Roman, can you talk about India?
Indians, a lot of the same motivations and things that underpin Russian recruitment in Nepal apply to Indian as well. There are obviously Gurkha units in India as well. There is widespread poverty. And I think an underdiscussed aspect of this is that there is not quite a kinship, but a familiarity with Russia. In fact, my own father, who is from Bangladesh, came to the Soviet Union in the 80s to study because the Soviet Union at the time provided a free university to people from the third world. That applied a lot of the kind of middle class of India and Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan took advantage of these programs. They traveled to the Soviet Union. In some cases, they started families like mine. In others, they just came back to their home country with a knowledge of Russian and a head full of Russian propaganda and maybe an engineering degree. And that also plays a big role in their recruitment policies. But of course, Russians love lying. To illustrate kind of some of the tactics they've used, there's a story out of India of 4 Indian citizens who were directly sent to the military despite being told that they would simply be security guards. There are videos of Punjabis who also applied for jobs in Russia. Turns out the job was army, even though they were not informed or told about this when they were signing up. And given the size of India and given the corruption in India, it's very likely that these stories are a lot more widespread than what has just been reported, especially under the current Indian government, which is playing a very delicate balancing act between supporting Western interests and cultivating their own ties with Russia and other non-Western countries and powers.
Yeah, I was curious about this because you're Bengali, or half Bengali. And that seems to be what we're missing from this. So I've heard about recruitment from the other countries of South Asia. We got to talk about Nepal, obviously, India, obviously. Pakistan, some Sri Lankans. I haven't heard anything about Bangladesh. Do you have any theories about why? Is that just information that's available, or?
No, there have been stories in Bangladeshi media about Bengalis also being tricked to travel to Russia and being forcibly press ganged into the military. That's it doesn't really get that much news in the West because the West typically just doesn't care about most places in the world that isn't America or Europe. But the Russians are doing the same things as they are anywhere else. The Bangladeshi government is cooperating pretty closely with the Russian government, mostly because the Russian government is selling a lot of weapons to the Bangladeshi government at cut rate prices. Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world with one of the worst qualities of life. Of anywhere, it's not a great place. And as a result, there's not a lot of money for the government to buy fancy new Western weapons. And so they have to go shopping elsewhere. One of those places is Russia. So there are a lot of ties. It's just not very loud because Bangladesh just isn't that. It's just not a very rich country. And most people don't give a shit about it.
Okay, fair enough. So that just slipped under my own radar because these stories had appeared in English-speaking news about India a lot, but not as much elsewhere. Other countries where this applies to, there's been a lot of Nigerians, people from Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, a lot of Somalis who were enticed by the same reasons that we're about to go into. And of course, the Russians are not super racially progressive. So when you do see these soldiers in that context, it is often them being mistreated. We are also seeing some Syrians joining the Russian military. There's been a lot of cooperation, of course, between Russia and Syria. The Syrian Arab Army under Assad has been, in some cases, practically commanded by the Russians from time to time and for various operations. So the pipeline of recruiting Syrian Arab Army soldiers into Russia for a bigger payday just makes sense. Other countries have dealt very closely with Wagner. So a lot of recruits from Sudan, Mali, etc. are being introduced to the Russian military in their operations in Africa, especially Saharan Africa, and kind of pipelined in from there. To break down each one of these would take a tremendous amount of time. If any big stories come up, we'll cover them, but just kind of an overview there. But what are the reasons why people are doing this? Well, a lot of the countries we've listed are quite poor, and the money that's being offered by the Russian military is $2,000 a month. $2,000 a month is not a lot of money if you're an American. But if you're from Bangladesh, if you're from India, if you're from Nepal, if you're from Nigeria, $2,000 a month, it is more money than anyone in your family has seen.
Hell, it's a lot of money in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, the $2,000 a month is a pretty healthy middle-class salary.
Upper middle class, I would say.
Yeah, so it's a very, very tempting offer to take, which is why some people have gone out of their way in order to take it. When they're getting their $2,000 a month, and honestly, I'm not going to be always trusting their paymasters to have everything on time, but we don't have a great way of knowing that specifically. But we do know that they can take most of that money, send it back to their families, support like a lot of people with that $2,000 a month. So I think the economic answer is the predominant one. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. But also, a lot, like we were saying, they're just lied to. A lot of them are being told that they're taking jobs in Russia. A lot of them are going to university in Russia or taking a different job. Like the Punjabis that we mentioned were supposed to have been security guards somewhere before being put into the army and thrown at the front. So $2,000 a month to risk your life, risking your life, and a high chance of dying. Even that big paycheck might not be worth it. So you need that extra dose of deception and lying to get you over the line. These visa dealers, these people lying to them about what they'll be doing. Because a lot of cases, even we think of Russia as, a pretty poor, backwards country, and in many ways it is. But compared to a lot of countries of Africa, a lot of countries of Asia, it's still more economically developed, still has better job opportunities, still has higher quality of life than what they may have back home.
I'll be specific here and say the Russian military has money to pay these comparatively high salaries. It is unlikely that there are many other positions in Russia that are able to offer that high rates to economic migrants. In fact, we can tell by the main economic migrants in Russia, those being people from Central Asian countries, that they typically don't really have that much. Their incomes aren't that high, though they are higher than what they would receive doing an equivalent job in their home country.
I don't mean the $2,000 a month would be normal in Russia by any stretch of the imagination. But if they are offered, if you are a poor person from Nigeria who is offered a chance to go to university in Russia, and a lot of people will take that deal, army, no army, war, no war. We're talking just normal global migration pattern type stuff of people moving from poor places to comparatively wealthier places. And that is a factor here, at least as far as these lying visa dealers go. And then the bait and switch happens later. And the last thing here is just normal military romanticism. There is apparently a lot of soldiers from India and other places who are posting on TikTok and whatever social media is most popular in whatever country we're referring to of, look at me, I'm being a cool soldier stuff. Young men often are attracted to doing heroic things. And if I can be like this cool badass with a gun over in Russia fighting against the Americans, like that has been a very significant factor as well, is just young guys who think that they'll look cool wearing armor and carrying guns.
And, fighting against what they perceive to be the evil West is definitely a plus for these people. As many Africans have made it clear, even those Africans who don't support Russia, the fact is that Western nations don't give a shit about the rest of the world. And often use these countries that Russia is recruiting from as places to extract labor and little else, labor and resources. And as a result, these countries, citizens of these countries, don't really like the West. They have no particular love. They don't believe in purported values that diplomats speak of equality and liberty. These are just words that they have never seen in action from anyone, not from their own government and not from Western governments in relation to them. And so it's no surprise that they buy into propaganda saying that Russia is fighting a defensive war against evil NATO. For all they know, in their experience, this might as well be true.
So those are our three basic reasons: ideology, money, and just being lied to. But one more thing did come up this week that added to this overall story. It's on April 2nd, Ukraine launched a drone attack on a drone production facility in Tatarstan in Russia. This drone production facility was attached to the Alabuka Polytechnic College. And one of these drones struck into the workers' dormitory for this factory that's attached to this polytechnic. And as this more information came out about this, there was a video put out by the students at this college, and many of saying that we are Africans who came to Russia for an education. I'm going to be working in this job. And the evil Ukrainians came and attacked us, with no mention that this was actually a drone production facility to make drones to kill Ukrainians, and therefore a completely valid and legal military target. But who did Russia put inside of this valid and legal military target? Foreign students. These foreign students, apparently they were making suicide drones, these Shahed suicide drones, as some kind of work-study program.
It was a work experience thing.
Yeah, an internship. And This struck me as so incredibly cynical because they knew that this would be a target eventually. And so they put a group of people who would be more media friendly. So instead of some gruff alcoholic Vopnik type guy saying how they bombed the factory that I was in, it was instead some young African woman saying that the mean Ukrainians attacked us with no mention of why they did so. And this is a lot of the same thing. They were told they were going to get a university education in Russia, a large and powerful country. And when they showed up, they were instead thrown into war production factories. So we're not only talking about soldiers here, we're talking about all elements of the Russian war effort are being used in the same kind of chain that we've already been describing.
And foreign students are an especially vulnerable population. Not only do they very often know the local language very poorly, and therefore it's difficult for them to protest what's being done to them. In a lot of cases, like in this particular attack, the students are told that they will have their visas revoked if they do not agree to work. If you are a second or third year student at a medical college, or you're doing an engineering degree, being told that basically you're going to be kicked out of school for no reason other than we can do it unless you agree to be a wage slave at a arms factory, you don't have a lot of choice in the matter. There's not much you can do. Very often, these foreign students, their families have put almost all of their savings into sending their kids abroad so they could get an education. It's, like Anthony said, incredibly, incredibly cynical, and unfortunately perfectly in line with how the Russian state views humans, which is pretty much just as batteries.
So this was planned to be the big foreign fighters episode that I've been kind of keeping in the drafts for probably like 3 months now in one way or another. But one more very bizarre story came up that I just have to talk about it. And that's this declaration from various higher ups within the Russian Orthodox Church declaring a set of actual political policies that they want to push as an organization. Well, it wasn't technically as an organization, but it was a joint declaration by various higher-ups of the Russian Orthodox Church, though not technically by the Russian Orthodox Church. So if you're going to be pedantic, I guess throw that out. And this is called, quote, the Order of the 25th World Russian People's Council, the Present and Future of the Russian World, the Ruski Mir. And it laid out how they want the political program of Russia as a country to play out. And there are some expected things in here, but also some very bizarre things I didn't quite expect them to go into. And this is divided up within 8 broad points. They are the special military operation, aka the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a Russian world, foreign policy, family and demographic policy, migration policy, education and upbringing, spatial and urban development, and economic development. I want to run through these to get an idea of where the Russian church is at and really the threat that they pose. So in the first segment on these quote-unquote special military operation, I'll just read a chunk from it because this statement is a pretty powerful one. So, quote, the special military operation is a new stage in the national liberation struggle of the Russian people against the criminal Kiev regime and the collective West behind it, waged on the lands of the southwestern Rus, not Russia, since 2014. During the special military operation, the Russian people, with arms in hand, defended their lives, freedom, statehood, civilizational, religious, national, and cultural identity, as well as the right to live on their own land within the borders of a single Russian state. From a spiritual and moral point of view, the special military operation is a holy war in which Russia and its people, defending the single spiritual space of Holy Rus, fulfill the mission of holding, protecting the world from the onslaught of globalism and the victory of the West, which has fallen into Satanism. After the completion of the Northeast Military District, the entire territory of modern Ukraine should enter the zone of exclusive influence of Russia. The possibility of the existence in this territory of a Russophobic political regime hostile to Russia and its people, as well as a political regime controlled from an external center hostile to Russia, must be completely excluded. So this is the religious base of Holy Rus, the Russian Orthodox Church, the East Slavic people under the Russian Orthodox Church, and that the whole of Ukraine must be made subservient to Russia. Not just Donbass and Crimea, like some, aka Trump, are suggesting, but the entire country of Ukraine. And this is a holy war. This is not just a border dispute, as some have portrayed it as, but a holy war. And that this holy war is not just against Ukraine, but the West as a whole, which has, quote, fallen into Satanism. There is no room for gray area here. There is no room for compromise. It's a war against Satan. There can be no compromise in war against Satan. So any delusions you may have about the Russians having some lesser goals, throw them out. This is a holy war. And these themes are continued throughout this declaration. It's a pretty repetitive declaration, actually. Could really use an editor to go in there. And a good example of that is that these next two sections, the Russian world and foreign policy, are the same thing. They basically just repeat themselves 2 times over. You can say that this is partially poor writing, which as an editor, I would say this is poor writing. But it also shows where they stand. Their foreign policy is the expansion of the Russian world. The Russian world, as they say, is the great Russian people, aka Russians, the little Russians, also known as Ukrainians, and the white Russians, also known as Belarusians, must be forged into a single nation state, under a single ruler and a single church. And, quote, building a 1,000-year Russian statehood is the highest form of political creativity of Russians as a nation. The Russian people, the Russian religion, aims to form a singular Russian state, including the Ukrainians and Belarusians, which they say cannot be seen as separate people, but merely subcategories of a larger Russian people. However, within foreign policy, they do bring up something which they've kind of been dancing around lately, but I'll just say it. So Russia must become a refuge state for all compatriots of the world suffering from the onslaught of Western globalism, wars, and discrimination. In addition to our compatriots, our country can become a refuge for millions of foreigners who defend traditional values, are loyal to Russia, and are ready for linguistic and cultural integration into our country. They are inviting the global far right to Russia to become Russian. We've seen this before. They have invited Boers, Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, to Russia because they say that they have no future within South Africa, which is a racist state against them. So come to Russia where you can continue being Boers. We have seen quite a few Americans also do this. One guy who I follow on TikTok was a January 6th rioter who tried to overthrow the government. The feds are on his ass, so he fled to Russia and is now doing his thing there as some kind of propagandist. He's quite a bizarre person. Not going to name drop to get him any traffic, but that's the kind of person that they're going after. Send us your Nazis, your Nazbols, your weird far-right freaks yearning to put the boot on minorities. And just to kind of skip ahead and merge that into something else, is that they've also said that, quote, the massive influx of migrants who do not speak Russian, who do not have a proper understanding of Russian history and culture, and therefore are not capable of integration into Russian society, is changing the appearance, of Russian cities, which leads to the deformation of the country's unified legal, cultural, and linguistic space. Put these two together, we do not want immigrants from Central Asia and Africa coming here, kind of meld that in with our foreign recruitment part of this episode. What we want coming here are weird, racist, American, European, white people to come and learn Russian and acculturate as Russians to make our country whiter, more conservative, and generally more violent and reactionary. Russia has played this role in the past. During the wave of revolutions, especially the French Revolution, much of the French noble class fled to Russia and reestablished themselves there. including the founders of the modern city of Odessa, with the caveat that there had been pre-existing settlements there. So not the founders of Odessa itself, but the founders of the Russian imperial project of building a port sea on the Black Sea called Odessa. A lot of them were French aristocrats who fled France during the Revolution. There are various versions of that throughout Russian history, so this is not exactly new, but very interesting how they want more migrants, but not those migrants. The massive influx of migrants are ruining Russia. Who we want are the white Nazis to come here instead. This ties into their family and demographic policy, which mostly comes down to pronatalism, get people to have as many babies as possible, though a lot of the policies they've tried for this do not work. Hungary has tried for a very conservative version of pronatalism, and it has not helped them out very well. But most of this has to do with being anti-abortion. They opposed abortion on religious grounds, of course, but they also see it as decreasing the population of Russia. And for this, I want to look at Ceausescu's Romania. Ceausescu's Romania wanted to increase the population of Romania. They saw abortion is a serious demographic threat, so they made abortion legal, and all that caused was to push abortion underground, have it in very dangerous places, and a lot of babies who were given up were then passed into the human trafficking rings. So these policies do not work unless you want to increase human suffering, which of course the Russian Orthodox Church absolutely does. Next, I want to go into education and upbringing. So quote here, domestic educational programs as well as upbringing programs must be cleared of destructive ideological concepts and attitudes, especially Western ones, that are alien to the Russian people and destructive for Russian society. A new socio-humanitarian paradigm based on Russian civilizational identity and traditional Russian spiritual and moral values must be developed and introduced into domestic teaching of social and humanitarian disciplines. So Ron DeSantis. So look to the US and the banning of various progressive ideas in schools, in especially Florida, but spreading to other states as well. That's what comes to mind here. But they want to have a very strong indoctrination program. They do not see the Russians as being properly conservative enough. They must be purged of Western influences and raised into the values of the Russian Orthodox Church, which include domestic abuse, which include genocide and invading Ukraine. So if this sounds nice to you on, raising the children with proper morals, these morals are genocidal and violent and horrific. But this next one is the one that really stuck out to me the most because I'm used to this other stuff. This is all the things that the Russian Orthodox Church has been saying. They've called this a holy war before. The Russian Orthodox Church has called for the extermination of Ukraine before. But this one was weird, which was spatial and urban development. They think that Russia is too urbanized. They do not like that so much of the country is Moscow and the major cities. And I can kind of agree with that. Russia is weirdly centralized into just being about Moscow. That's a political choice, though. Political choice based on the same ideologies that they promote. So I don't know how they can somehow reverse that. But their idea is to make everything suburban. And I understand where they're coming from here. They see private house ownerships, they see suburbanization, they see, America's style suburban housing developments is what they want for Russia. But this is where my fellow internet urbanists come in and say that's a terrible idea. It's terrible economically. It's terrible socially. If you're going to have some kind of religious society, suburbanization is awful for you because what it does is it leads to societal atomization. What happened to America during suburbanization would just happen to Russia during suburbanization, which is that it would be harder and harder to have these communal organizations. That's just how it is. See the very famous book Bowling Alone that describes how the processes of suburbanization in America throughout the 20th century led to the dissolution of social ties and such. Declining church attendance, the whole deal. So I don't think the Russian Orthodox Church is very read up on the latest and greatest of urbanization theory. So all these, the bike guy on YouTube would lose his mind or that whole segment. I really want to show the internet urbanists this document so we can get a whole new base of support for Ukraine. And what they're referring to here is the Gardarika of the 21st century. So this is one of those strange concepts that does not work its way into US very much. Gardarika is what was the name for the Rus state in the Middle Ages, given to it by the Norse. Many cities is what it means. It's a nation of many cities. And how I have usually seen this word in the Russian political context is through the form of decentralization, through liberalization, through taking power away from the Moscow metropolis and allowing it to be more dispersed and decentralized and democratic. But instead, they see it as the city itself is corrosive to morals. And so we have to get away from the city and form these smaller communities that are more religious, more traditional than some Moscow hipster. And this has a very long history of various reactionaries seeing the city as the source of evil and the countryside as the source of good moral virtue. It's just that over and over again. Though, like I said, that isn't actually how it tends to play out. And then just for all the other reasons that for most ways, having an urbanized country is better than having a suburbanized one. I don't know how deep to go into suburbs bad, but suburbs bad. And the last segment is economic development. It was very short. It's the shortest segment here. Didn't say anything. Make the economy better and Russia will be better. That's about it. This document, this declaration of holy war, this description of a Russian Orthodox religious world order that they want to see, I felt it had to be shared with you because it was so bizarre and outlandish in some place. And then just that last bit of suburbanization, de-urbanization, that's just weird. And I feel as though if more people hear about it in internet urban scholar space, we can really build up more of a force against the Russian Orthodox Church. But that's all we have for you this week. If you would like to support Ukraine more broadly, you can go to our list of links I put in the description, including the link tree. Please contact your congresspeople and ask them to push through Ukraine funding. The part where we talked about the Russians making advances, those advances are happening because Ukraine does not have the ammunition to fight them off. Kharkiv is being hit by all these missiles because Ukraine does not have the air defense capability that it needs. Talk to your congresspeople, get Ukraine support that we have not had for months and months now. If you'd like to support this show, tell your friends about us, like us, subscribe, leave comments. Those all help with the algorithm, and we are all but slaves to the algorithm. If you'd like to support us financially, go to patreon.com/UkraineWithoutHype. and join our list of supporters, which includes access to our Discord channel. I have recently put on Discord a essay about the movie Dune, nothing to do with Ukraine. I just wanted to write about Dune. So I'd now like to thank our supporters. So thank you very much to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kokryatskaya, Michael Drucker, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dmitry Litvin, Etienne, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, Mike Perrone, PLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T-Bart, Vivek, Adam Poppenheimer, Ada McDonald, Alex Drochmal, Anastasia, Barbara, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Emily Bavona, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Laura De Leon, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Lucy Koselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Berry, Scott Gengris, Scott Torkayuk, Steven, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica Aim, Victoria Leontineva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much. You're what make this all possible. So until next week, Slava Ukraini!